Hello everybody out there tuning in to today's online session, a panel with distinguished guests from basically all over the world, almost at least. My name is Anna Bjerkerud, happy to be on camera, jazz hands, tuning in from Stockholm and EBG Network, a website and a company that I run that aim to gather and share cross-functional and cross-industry, cross-organization business intelligence, focusing on sourcing, procurement and finance professionals. Like we do today, I see John before me, I see Phil before me. We also have David on the phone, and we're waiting for Chris to get on the phone from an airport in New York or wherever he may be. Today we're going to talk about trends in procurement and what they can imply for you who work with procurement. When leading up to this webinar, we already started talking in the waiting room about Brexit, of course, very hot topic for anyone doing business in Europe and the world today. You who listen in will be involved, and you can at all times send in your questions in the control panel on your right hand side in the question section or in the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many of the questions as we possibly can. But with that said, I would like first of all to hand over to Snea from Zycus, who are enabling us to do this session today to gather these great minds. Snea, over to you.
Absolutely, Anna. Thank you very much for the introduction. So introducing Zycus, we are a leading provider of complete source-to-pay suite of procurement performance solutions. Our comprehensive product portfolio includes applications for both the strategic and the operational aspects of procurement. So as you can see on the wheel, from e-procurement, invoicing, spend analysis, contract management, to financial savings management, we have it all covered with our in-house and organically built source-to-pay suite. So moving to the next slide, John, in fact, you would see that Zycus is the only procurement vendor to have been recognized as a leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for Strategic Sourcing Application Suite for 4 years in a row, starting from 2013 to the latest report that came out in 2018. In the next slide, you can see that we have been recognized as a leader for the second time in a row in the Forrester Wave report for source to contract suites in January 2009, which came out recently. Now moving ahead, the second edition of Horizon, which is the flagship event organized by Zycus Inc. for procurement, finance, and supply chain leaders, is being held at Budapest from June 2 to 4, 2019. You can join us at our 3-day conference to explore the depth of procurement performance and engage in sessions focusing on procurement transformation. So the theme for this edition of the conference is Beyond Digitization, the Dawn of Autonomous Procurement. And for a special offer that commenced on Women's Day, we are giving away tickets at €99, which is inclusive of the conference pass, and stay at the 5-star New York Palace, the Dedica Anthology Budapest. This all-inclusive offer is valid only till the 15th of March. So if you're interested in attending this conference, please register on the event website at www.horizon.zycus.com/Europe. So without further ado, I am handing it over to John, who will introduce the speakers for today and start with the webinar.
Thank you, Anne, and of course, thank you, Snea. I'm your host, John Hansen, our moderator, or co-panelist, and I'd like to first of all welcome David Losby as one of our panelists. David, if you could, and I know we have an impressive overview of your background, but if you could just take a minute or two to introduce yourself to our audience. Oh, I think David's on mute. All right. Oh, he may still be on mute. You know what? We'll jump past this. Phil, you can hear me, right?
I can hear you, John, yes.
So while we wait for David to come back online here, tell us a little bit about yourself, Phil.
Okay, well, I work for the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, CIPS. CIPS is the leading global organization supporting the procurement and supply management profession. We're recognized as the global standard and the global voice of the profession. Our mission very much is to promote the value that good procurement and supply management can bring to organizations and to communities. We do a lot of work internationally with people like the Gates Foundation, the UN, World Bank, to support recovering and emerging economies, as well as work with corporate organizations in countries all around the world. But at the heart of all that is enabling careers, enabling people to study and to gain professional accreditation, and consequently to have very, very successful careers traveling the world, spending other people's money, which can't be a bad thing, can it?
Well, it should be very interesting to get your perspective, because again, with CIP's role and active membership base, we're obviously going to get a wide range and diverse experiences and insights you'll have to share relative to these trends. So I thank you for joining us, Phil. And I see now
Pleasure.
We have David
Pleasure.
on the line. David, how are you? Hello, David? Well, this is interesting. Everybody else, Phil, you can still hear me clearly, correct?
I can, yes. Yeah, I can hear you.
See, I've got it. His microphone is not muted, so I'm not sure why we're not picking him up. But David, we will look forward to hearing you as soon as we can. Chris Sawchuk will be joining us. Chris is en route in New York, but he was eager to participate in this discussion, and he should be joining us any time now. And as soon as he does, we'll welcome him here. But in the meantime, Anna, if you could check and see what the problem is.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, David. Welcome.
Can you pick me up?
You're fading in and out a little bit. You're fading in and out a little bit. Hello? Okay. Well, Phil, it's you and me. We're going to fly this. David will hopefully be able to join us shortly. I, of course, am your moderator, John Hansen, Procurement Insights. You can read about me here. I don't want to spend too much time on myself, other than to say I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion at hand. I want to remind everyone that there is a tweet chat with the hashtag #ZycusProcTrends, where we'll be sharing poll results as well as other such elements of our conversation today, and inspiring further dialogue with some additional thought leaders who may be attending this webinar, or of course may not be able to make it but want to share their perspective on where the world is going. And where the world is going, we've got three things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the greatest area of impact, the top 10, what we call the top 10 trends that have been prognosticated, if you will. I don't know if that's the right word, Phil, but prognostication of where the industry is going and what is going to have the greatest impact. And then we wanted to get what I consider to be my big three, and we want to get into these discussion points. Now, one thing I want to encourage you is there will be a Q&A at the end of this webinar, but throughout the entire session, we're going to have interactive polls, which we'd encourage you to participate and share your ideas as to what you feel are the most influential elements that are changing your world. Also want to remind you that the chat room is open, so you don't have to wait till the end. We don't want you to just be listeners. We want you to be an active participant in the dialogue. So I'm going to encourage you to avail yourself of these two options. Now let's start with the first section in terms of perception equally reality, and I want to turn over the poll now to Anna. But what we're asking is, in which area will your organization experience the greatest change in 2019? From a technology standpoint, the cloud and the edge. Now, everyone's heard of, again, digital transformation. The cloud you're probably familiar with. Working on the edge is something we'll get into. I won't tell you exactly what the edge is, although I would imagine you know it. But if you don't, certainly I would be interested in seeing what your response would be in that regard. Workforce, i.e. skill sets and generational impact. what's happening. There has been a number of studies that have come out indicating that the talent gap in our industry, especially with digital coming and emerging on the scene, is growing exponentially rather than compressing. So we have talent shortages to deal with. Processes, Excel. How many of you still use an Excel spreadsheet? How many of you moved to the relational model from the adversarial model? And of course, others. So what I want to do is, Anna, if you could, after posing these questions, is turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. So it's time for you to engage, and we'll share the results as a percentage as soon as you've done your choice. And you may only select one of the following. So is it technology? Is it workforce? Is it process? Or is it something completely else? And if it's something completely else, we'd love you to help us, to enlighten us by sharing those thoughts on what area that your organization will experience the greatest change in 2019. So is it technology? Is it workforce, process, or other? And we do have a question that has come in already, John. So let me know later on when you want me to share that. And like we said, feel free to type them in whenever you can. So we have 68% of you having voted, slightly over 70%. I'm going to give you a couple of more seconds to choose. We'll share the results as a percentage shortly, and then we'll hear what John and Phil has to say about it. So I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1, and sharing the results. So, in which area will your organization experience the greatest change in 2019? 47% of you said technology. 22% of you said workforce. 31% of you said process, and none said 0%. And we have a fair amount of live audience persons here. So interesting results. The panel, what do you make of these results?
Well, you know what, Phil, I'll turn it over to you right off the bat. Any surprises there for you?
I don't think there's any surprises. I think it's interesting that there's a kind of a spread across the top three. I think the one that for me I think is the biggest challenge and should see the biggest change is around the workforce with skill sets, because I think kind of if you as we go through this discussion, most of what will come out will require people, the challenges will require people to learn new skills, to behave differently. So the kind of workforce thing for me pervades everything. I think there will be a lot of technological change, and some of it will work and some of it won't, and some of it will be good and some of it will make no difference whatsoever. I think there's a lot of opportunity to change technology, and a lot of organizations desire to change technology, and I think even more feel they have to change technology. But whether they're doing the right thing in the right way, and whether the people have the capability to make the most of the opportunities that technology can bring, I think will fuel the rest of the discussion, I think.
Well, it's kind of interesting, and I want to touch on a couple of slides and with numbers that, again, will be made available. The resources will be made available when we provide the on-demand version. But this is some interesting things. In 2010, the number of personal devices globally was 1.84. That's 1.84 IoT or personal devices per person. By 2020, there'll be 10 web-connected devices. The global survey is 43% of IoT talk about, or executives talk about, want to build on-the-edge computing. Now, on-the-edge computing, Phil, was talking about the fact that instead of pushing things through to the cloud, that most decisions will be made on the edge with these handheld devices, and then they'll be reporting back to the cloud device. In other words, a degree of decentralized autonomy, which is an interesting thing from a technology standpoint, because hasn't it always been the case that we've looked at technology or procurement from the practice of we need to centralize everything and gain control and gain spend? I mean, the technology is really stretching that direction in a new way. And of course, digital technology will account for 60% plus of global GDP. It will be digitized. I mean, put aside those enormous numbers, we're heading towards a technology standpoint. So let me ask you this, Phil. If you look at computing on the edge, if you look at the traditional way in which we've operated in the procurement world, where centralization was key, where we were controlling everything, I mean, is technology going to force us to do things so much differently? And part of the difficulty with or obstacles to adoption is the fact that we're not used to working that way. We're not used to working in what you call a segmented frontline basis. We need everything controlled. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do, yeah, I do. And I think, it'll be the classic pendulum. We tend to be black or white. We tend to swing one way or the other way. And, everything's centralized, everything's decentralized, everything. But I think that the challenge will be where to use different tactics, where decentralization works best, where to use on the edge stuff out in the field, because it enables things to move quicker and probably more accurately. But then when things need to come back and people need to make more strategic decisions, and I think an awful lot of organizations are struggling with this, it tends to be one thing or the other. Everything has to be done in a certain way, or so I think the challenge is talking to organizations in different sectors. Oil and gas, for example, I was working with people there a couple of years ago when they were talking very much about this, idea of handheld devices, people clocking things, people checking on things, people entering data out in the field, and it was speeding things up massively. But then it's a case of, okay, well, you've collected that data, where does it go? What happens then? And is it working smoothly? Is it enabling things to be quicker, more efficient, and more accurate, and better decisions to be made? And I think that's sometimes where technology provides us with opportunity that doesn't always work out for the best.
Well, it's interesting. I just want to put this variable in there. Gartner did a study, and they found that 80% of companies who had made the move to the cloud, the public cloud, we're talking about, we're over the next 12 to 18 months going to repatriate that app or data back to either a private cloud or a on-site or on-premise server farm. And you're nodding up and down, so it doesn't surprise you, obviously.
No.
But does that not create a difficulty for people, let's say in our audience who are in the procurement world, who are saying, well, if we're going one way one day, and they made this precipitous jump because everyone didn't want to be left behind without fully understanding what the cloud meant or going into the cloud meant. And then they're retracting. Doesn't that create another level of difficulty as to, well, we're going here, now we're going there? What do you do in a situation like that?
It's really, really tough. And I think a lot depends on, kind of the, who's making the decisions, who's writing the strategy, whether this is a long-term thing. I was talking to somebody a little while ago, and it was in the energy sector, and they were talking about kind of energy strategies and all sorts. But the principle holds good, and the story was very much around CEO reads the Sunday papers at home one weekend, and he reads all about this fantastic cloud digitalization, digital transformation, whatever it is, and how it's going to make everybody more profitable. Walks in on the Monday morning, says, right, that's what we're going to do. Nobody else has got a clue what he's talking about or what he means, but he's seeing benefit to the bottom line and efficiencies and all sorts, and it filters down, and everybody goes off and does something slightly different. It's a very, very simplistic analogy, but there's an awful lot of that in there somewhere. There's an awful lot of truth in that, where unless for a digital transformation, you've got a very, very, very clear idea where the end game is, how long it's going to take, the investment that's needed to get there, exactly what benefits you're trying to get, exactly what objectives and aims you're trying to achieve, and everything is properly joined up across all functions of the organization with common strategies and common goals, then you get hairs running all over the place. And I think that's where some of this comes in, that you get swinging from one back to the other, and is it in the cloud, is it on the edge, where is it, what is it, everybody trying something different. So it's a very simplistic view, but I think there's a lot of truth in that, and that's why many companies and organizations struggle with implementing these kind of things efficiently, because it tends to be disjointed.
Well, now you see What's interesting is that implementing that you're talking about and looking at a bigger strategy. McKinsey did a survey last year of 1,600 what they called global incumbent companies. So the basis there are larger enterprises, and only 23% of the executives who responded to the survey said they had a digital strategy, and only 2% of those have a digital strategy involving their supply chain. So in essence, going back to what you said, the 80% of the 23% are repatriating back from the cloud. I mean, the number is shrinking, and others are just sitting in this holding pattern and waiting. So if I'm in the audience right now, I'm saying to myself, well, we're talking about technology, it's going to have this impact, but we're vacillating between start, stop, go, forward, come back. And then we only have a small percentage doing this. I mean, it's got to create a ripple effect where people just eventually turn off to it to a certain degree and say, wait a second, you know, is this real? Is it even something that I should be paying attention to? I mean, am I waxing polemic on this type of thing here, or are we? Does it make sense?
No, I think you know, there's with digital. I think, you know, there has to be kind of, you know, strong digital leadership that understands what it all means, and it's, you know, prepared to make the necessary investment, not just in resources but in time as well, because again, you know, these things don't take 5 minutes and don't give instant paybacks. To really embed something that's going to be transformational, it takes time and it takes proper investment. And you also have to, you know, it's not just about the technology, it's about the mindset, and it's about the skill sets that go with that. And ultimately, you know, there's an element of risk in this, and I think, you know, organizations that get it right are organizations that do have a very strong, you know, appetite for an understanding of risk.
Okay, because I want to get into the risk element shortly. Because I want you to pause here. I think, David, you're able to join us now. Am I mistaken or not?
No, I hope so, John. I don't know whether you can hear me well this time.
You're coming through a lot better. You know, and David, just to sort of dovetail you into this discussion, were you able to hear the results of the first poll we took in terms of which ones are the most likely to have the greatest influence according to our audience?
I was indeed. I guess probably a little bit like the bit that I heard from Phil, which is I probably would have expected a slightly higher result in terms of the workforce, so the people skills being more, how could I put it, significant in terms of the changes, particularly when we hear from many people that the big issue is around talent and finding people that not only understand the processes and the systems and be able to turn data into insight, but actually the people skills to be able to communicate effectively, to be able to engage with different stakeholders on different levels, has indeed been I guess a part of the Achilles heel of the profession, in fact many professions, for many years. So I would see that as being one of the ongoing and probably most significant challenges that we face going forward.
Well, now, and David, I want to go to you, and then I'll go to you, Phil, on this. Looking at the DHL study, and they talk about leadership quality, strategic thinking, operational expertise. I'm taken back 12 years to 2007 in a CPO agenda roundtable discussion in which top executives came together from major corporations around the world. I've written about this extensively, which said that we would take one strategic thinker over 10 everyday run-of-the-mill buyers. And I'm thinking, is this now what you're talking about, David? And then I'll go to you, Phil. But David, is this what we're talking about now, the manifestation or the realization of that observation? You know, we're looking at DHL saying leadership quality, strategic thinking, operational expertise. You know, the fact that we're now going, a big percentage of the current procurement staff is going into retirement age, all of these other factors. I mean, is this finally the realization of what was said so many years ago?
I think it absolutely is. And if you think about the 2016 World Economic Forum report that called out 7 skills, critical skills for jobs for the future, and some of those were talking about, you know, collaboration across networks and leading by influence, agility, adaptability, you know, effective oral and written communication, curiosity and imagination as key skills. And if you think about the fact that what we're trying to create is a series of value architects in businesses, people that are more strategic thinking, have understood exactly how the critical thinking skills need to apply within businesses. Because if you think about the rationality of simply applying what we did in the past as means of solving future problems, it's not going to be sufficient. So therefore, we do need this thinking that is different to be able to apply to forthcoming problems and issues.
Okay, so now hearing what David had to say, and we'll want to move to the next section shortly, but Phil, if you look at SIP's role, and you've seen the evolution of curriculums, you've seen the evolution of development, I mean, separate and apart from technology, is it not safe to say that this redevelopment or this redefinition of capabilities is in and of itself so very important?
Yeah, I think it is, and I would agree with much of what David said. I mean, I think the answer to your question is yes. The artificial intelligence is undoubtedly going to take away a lot of the lower level jobs. So your 10 tactical people will be chatbots and AI. So there's a threat to the profession. There's also a massive opportunity for the profession to step up and become a fundamental, integral part of business. Rather than the old-fashioned backroom service that procurement provided many years ago. We talk extensively about the shift from gatekeeper to being a trusted advisor. A real influential part of the strategic direction and value creating opportunity for the business. More and more procurement is challenged to add to the revenue line. We talk about architects of innovation. We talk about the need for people to stop talking procurelish and talk the language of business. To be able to sit at the top table and talk to the CFO in his language and the operations officer in his language, etc., etc. So procurement has the opportunity to source absolutely vital information on commodities, market research, talking to suppliers about what the art of the possible. So finding out that information and being able to walk into the business day after day after day and challenge stakeholders and internal customers and say, did you know we can now do this? Did you know this is going to happen? We need to be mindful of this. We need to be planning for that. That is the opportunity, and that's a whole new skill set. So in terms of the facts you have on the slide here and your comment, one strategic thinker rather than 10 tactical doers, absolutely. And we hear that. Sorry.
Here's an interesting thought here in terms of, because people get lost in the technology. I think we transitioned to this role change, or the redefinition of what a procurement professional does is important. When we look at process side of things, Phil, and then I'll go back to you, David. When we look at process, we talk about and spreadsheet. It's kind of interesting. We did a poll, Procurement Insights, recently, and said, will procurement professionals ever stop using Excel? And 56% said no, and we'll never stop using it. 33% asked, is there an alternative? So, I mean, is this where the process is the crossroads of the marriage between technology and people skills? And the third thing with Deloitte's report about better relationship management, moving from an adversarial model, so to speak, into a relational model. I mean, if you look at and Anna, if you could just very quickly give us the percentage points again with each survey response.
Yes, so we had 47% saying technology, 22% workforce, 31% process.
So thanks, Anna. And so in the context of that, Phil, and then I'll go to you, David, in the context of that, it seems that these are all intricately connected one to the other, so they don't operate independently of each other. I mean, is that a safe way to look at it? In other words, technological advancement will happen, but it won't happen without workforce development. But workforce development is dependent upon a change in thinking of process and how you approach relationships with suppliers, for example. I mean, is this the juxtaposition of all three of these things?
Yes, it is. And I think, as the next generation comes through, You know, I've got two lads. I've got a 19-year-old and a 24-year-old. They do exactly the same things as I do, but they just use different tools. They use the tools they're familiar with, and they use processes, and they think in slightly different ways. You know, ultimately, and this is where, you know, the human will win out over the robot at the moment, because it's, you know, it's tackling challenges, and it's the thought process, and it's training people to think, and it's training people to behave in certain ways. So that's why you'll hear people who, you know, I was talking to a couple of CPOs at an event a little while ago, and we're talking about the talent of the future and the kind of people that they're looking for. And they're not necessarily, they're looking for people who have an interest in what procurement and supply chain management is all about, but they're not necessarily looking for people who are embedded in the procurement way of doing things. They're looking for commercial people. They're looking for people with social skills. They're looking for people who can hold relationships and build relationships and behave collaboratively, and operate in teams. And they'll use certain tools to do that. You know, I mean, I've grown up with spreadsheet, but I'm now using things that to me look like spreadsheet, but they've got a different font and many more colors, and you push different buttons, but they're doing the same job. So, you know, software tools, you know, all the business toolkit will change, but it's about the job that it does and ultimately what you're trying to achieve, which is why, going back to the original survey, when you had your 3 columns that I can't remember, but I think, you know, there was work, you know, there was a split across there, and actually they're all kind of interlinked. It's about an, you know, it's a classic. It's about an attitude. It's like sport. In my mind, it's always like football, or what you might call soccer. Inaccurately, it's football. The game, it's still the same game. It's still 22 players kicking a pig's bladder around, but you need a completely different approach. You need a different level of fitness. You need a different level of mental commitment and mental stability. You need, you know, all sorts of different things. The game has changed. The world's moved on, but ultimately, it's 90 minutes, 11 players aside, one side trying to score more goals than the other. So,
okay. Well, wait. Sorry to interrupt you here, but I want to take that thing. The games, there's been changes and developments, but the game has remained basically the same, Phil. And sorry to cut you off, but I want to go to David on this and give you a loaded question, David, and then we'll move on to the next section. With what Phil said, you know, the fax machine, the telephone, everything changed the way we do business. Is what we're experiencing now in the procurement professional unprecedented, in the profession, in the industry, unprecedented, with the emergence of digital transformation, cloud computing, on the edge, and all of these other elements? I mean, is this something that is unprecedented, unlike any other time? And those change, let's face it, the fax machine, the phone, spreadsheets, basic computers revolutionized the industry in their own way and their own time. But is this more significant what we're experiencing now than at any other time? David? I think we might have lost David again. That was a good question. Phil, you're still with me, right?
I am, yeah.
Okay, so we've lost David. Technical difficulties notwithstanding. Phil, is it unprecedented?
Yeah, I think it's things are moving way faster, and you know, you asked me you know, earlier to you know, what do I think is the thing that's going to affect procurement and supply chain this year more than anything else. And you know, I was talking about risk, and I was talking about things like, you know, the tariffs that are coming in, and Brexit, and you know, there's so many things happening out there at the moment. And you know, I glibly say that the game is still the same. You know, it's you know, it's just, you know, we're approaching things in a different way. Procurement and supply chain management fundamentally are still playing the same kind of role, but the level at which they're playing, the influence that the function has or should have, the responsibilities it's taking on. You know, business is far more asking procurement and supply chain management professionals to accept more responsibility, to solve more problems at a higher level. Consequently, you know, the language that people use, the conversations that they're having to get problems addressed and deliver solutions are at a much higher level. So for the individual, it is about raising their game. And for the profession, it's about raising its voice and saying, look at the great things that the profession is now achieving, how it's enabling businesses to be far more successful. and to address all these problems. So I think the world that the function and the professionals are operating in, it is unprecedented. We've never been here before, but the opportunity is absolutely massive. But it is about thinking. We've got a lot of different, on your slide here. Yeah, well, there's loads going on, but they're all interconnected.
Well, let's get to this slide. David, are you with us again? No, you know what, Phil? It's just you and me. So hopefully we'll figure out what these technical difficulties are. But going to the next poll. And by the way, Anna, you mentioned that there was already a question that had been posed in the chat room relative to the last section. Do you want to share that with me now?
Yeah, and should we do this poll and then do that, or do you want to do the question first?
Well, if it's done with the last section, let's deal with the question first, then we'll do the poll.
Yeah, and I really think that this question sort of encompasses all three of the areas that you've touched upon so far. It reads, there's a lot of buzz around regarding green procurement. My question is that how an organization totally engrossed, if you say that, in paper-based working can be encouraged to adopt paperless working, that to in a condition when the superiors are more comfortable with paper-based working, those not millennials perhaps being the superiors then, probably.
So we're talking about not using paper and saving a forest. I mean, is that the theme? We're talking about social consciousness overall here with the question, right?
I mean, green procurement. What do you read into that? I guess less paper, less is an overall.
Yeah,
I think selling paper, that is.
I think it's a big issue. I think the upcoming generation, the millennials and future generations, will put far more pressure on organizations and on society as a whole to be greener. Paper is a big thing. You're probably talking to the wrong person about getting rid of paper. I'm from a certain generation that likes my pens and paper and stacks of it on my desk. But it's bigger than that, and I think you can now use paper in a way that is green, that is responsible. But I think when you look at packaging, anybody who goes to the supermarket and comes back with a weekly shop and realizes how much packaging they're carrying, as well as the produce they bought, and you look at your recycling bin at the end of each week, it's quite frightening. So I think the next generation will put a huge amount of pressure on brands, on all sorts of organizations to be more socially responsible. I think it's about green and the environment. I also think it's about ethical procurement. It's about the awareness of modern slavery and supply chains. It's about all sorts of issues that mean that people will start to choose brands and companies and their own service providers as much on their socially responsible credentials as they do on price point or brand status. And I think it's a big opportunity, but again, going back to risk, it's a massive risk to reputation for organizations that get it wrong.
Okay, so let's do this, and I want to remind everybody, because we're running the hour here on this next session, and Anna, we're going to turn over the poll to you in about 10 seconds. We'll spend we want your feedback. We want your ideas to what you think. Oftentimes when it comes to prognosticating the trends of the future, it's the experts or the pundits doing the talking. We want you to have a say. What do you think, based on your experience, are the factors that are going to have the greatest impact? And that's the context of this next poll. And we'll spend about 10 minutes talking about this. Then we'll go into the last section and spend the remaining 20 on basically the closing. But Anna, if I could turn it over to you now.
Yes, thank you. So I'm launching the poll. Again, same procedure as last time. What are your top 3 trends? Is it talent shortage, blockchain, cybersecurity concerns, big data, other? And when you and I went through this beforehand, John, you were really keen on putting this not necessarily on a company level, but on a personal level, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that's the whole thing. What you as a professional believe are going to reshape your world. So it's not a collective we. What we're doing here is we want to know what you think and what your feeling is based upon the information that you have. So vote away.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, the slide before indicated a lot more options. So this is just some that we enforce you to choose from, and you may select one or more, preferably three. Is it talent shortage, blockchain? What is daunting? What is keeping you awake, or what is from in a bad way or in a good way, I guess? Blockchain, cybersecurity concerns, big data, or other. And while you do that, we have, so far we only have 50% of you voting. I'd be really happy if we can get above 70%. And just referring back to the question sent in, and you who sent it in, correct me if I'm wrong, but I interpret it as ways of working rather than what you're selling. So, and I guess that's also a Zycus type question, because I do think that today, looking at process gains, just process gains in automating and digitalizing ways of working can save a lot of money. And, you know, before we talked a lot about invoicing and e-orders and all of that too, of course, and we tried to put money on that. But the gains in working with less paper internally, if I'm mistaken, you can correct me, you who sent it in. Now we have a little over 73% of you voting. I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. And sharing the results. So 37% of you felt that talent shortage is one of your top 3 trends, 13% blockchain, 57% cybersecurity concerns, 73% big data, and 43% other. Of course, we're very intrigued what that other may be. Feel free. We encourage you to type it in the questions or chat area so we know and can bring it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Well, you know what? It looks like big data and cybersecurity concerns are the top 2, and in particular, big data. Phil, before I go, I'm going to see if I can prompt David if he's available. David, can you hear us? Nope, we still have. So again, Phil, going back to you. Number 1, any surprises in the response, and number 2, let's focus on big data, because it's one of those things that you hear bandied around in a certain degree of ubiquity, but it seems that very few people understand what big data actually is. So any surprises, and what about big data?
Well, yeah. Big data, what exactly is it? I think that's when people have indicated here, it's a top trend. I'd be really interested to understand kind of what they mean by that, because I think big data's been around for quite some time now. I mean, big data is getting bigger. I think the challenge with it is to, what do you do with it all? And I talking to organizations as we do, they're all churning out huge amounts of data, but I don't think too many really maximize the opportunities and the value that could potentially bring, or probably understand what those opportunities are. But I think we're all used to massive amounts of data if you want it, but there is an element of so what with it. What are you going to do? So I think cybersecurity, it's interesting that's up there as well. I think that's a massive concern and risk to organisations with the stuff around data, and then talent. We've talked a lot about talent. I think that's only going to get bigger for me.
Well, one of the things that was interesting, and when we go into big data and refer to Gartner's postmodern ERP era or proclamation a few years ago, one of the biggest problems that was cited with regards to information for procurement professionals under the old ERP-centric model is that the data was, by the time it was reintroduced back to the procurement front line, it had already become outdated. It was no longer effective. So now we've got this onslaught of information and data sifting through. So is it safe to say that in a lot of ways, when you look at big data, it's not really the question of whether or not the information is available on a timely basis. It's whether or not you can have actionable, meaningful data that you can do something with. And in that extension, Phil, the president of HP Canada told me in discussion that we're going to be working on the edge more. We're going to provide more autonomy. I mean, is the answer to sifting through big data providing a filtering process in which instead of the cloud pushing out to the handheld devices, it's actually on the edge, the handheld devices, solving problems in real time and then pushing that intelligence back to the cloud? I mean, is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, and I think that's probably the goal for a lot of organizations, to be able to work in that way, that you are right on the edge solving problems as they arise. You're constantly tweaking the machine. In a way that means it's like motor racing, Formula One. They use data in real time to solve problems while the car is whizzing around the track at many miles an hour, and it's it's in real time. It's as close to the edge as you could possibly get. So in a very clumsy analogy, it's that kind of thing where you sort of say, well, if you can use data in that way, if you're that on top of things, very, 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 very few organizations are. I think the vast majority, are churning out a massive amount of information, a massive amount of data, and then struggling to know what to do with it in any meaningful way.
Now, this is the interconnectability. You just prompted me on something. This is the interconnectability in all this, because we talk about the edge and data, but we also are talking about the talent pool. And if we have more people making important decisions on the edge at the localized, let's call it the localized basis, their skill sets and talent requirements are going to be much more demanding on them to be able to do that. And then the security element comes in, because it seems it's all interconnected. If we look at all these trends of impact, it's not isolated in silos. There's an interconnectability here. Then you have the security element of risk saying, well, if all that is being pushed out to the edge, there's our vulnerability between the cloud and the edge. I mean, is it safe to say that that's where you're only as strong as your weakest link? So you may have the data ability, you may have the computing ability, but if you don't have the skill sets to be able to take that information and do something with it, then that becomes, I won't say irrelevant, but certainly not as meaningful. And then if you can't protect the security of that data, then, so I mean, am I off the mark on that perception here?
No, not at all. I think that there's a huge amount in that, and I think that you're absolutely right in terms of, if you look at the future skill sets and the gaps in the workforce and where the demand will be, it's for collecting and collating data. It's not a problem. The machines will take care of that in spades. It's the analysis. It's making good use of that and protecting it and securing it and gaining competitive advantage. And that's where the investment is going to be in terms of future workforce, or one of the key areas. And that's where the opportunity is going to be. And that as soon as we get close to the edge will move. So it's a constantly evolving space.
It's a movable edge. Okay, so this is an interesting thing here, is that if we look, and we're going to go to the next section in a minute on what I consider the top three. The one thing that comes out of this whole discussion to me, and again, David, if you're hooked up and able to communicate with us, let us know. You're popping up on my screen there. Oh, David, are you there?
I am indeed.
Okay, so I don't know if you've been able to listen to what we've been talking about, but we've come to this point of realization. Well, I did. Phil, I think, already knew it, right? But when we talk about individual trends, the inherent flaw in that thinking is that they're siloed or independent one of the other. But as we saw from what our audience said in the poll, where they had cited the number one issue was big data, number two was cybersecurity, and number three, talent, that really they're all interconnected one with the other. And if you don't look at it as a collective whole and insist upon looking at the top three trends, and maybe that's why it shouldn't be the top three, because it does imply a singularity of instances, that's maybe where an inherent flaw comes into play.
I think so. And if you look at the reports and all the research that's been done, the reality is that the interdependency between the other things is actually quite critical, and therefore trying to say that it's pure tech or it's pure people or pure something else is the fallacy. I think that's where we're sort of making the gross error of judgment, and that what we need to do is make sure we've got a balance to whatever we're doing and articulating as a strategy and a way forward. And that will have to flex and shift depending on the context, the situation, and the requirement of the business and or the economic situation. And so I think what we need to be alert to is that we need a dynamic at play probably most of the time, rather than simply saying it's fixed or it's one thing or another. And I think that this is where I think the more intuitive leadership styles start to come into play, where we can then balance those factors and blend them effectively, much in the same way as you would with a recipe for a particular dish. And so therefore, the dish that we're serving here is one of trying to get to value, and recognizing how we'll realize that value will change from day to day.
All right. So here's and David, I'm going to start with you on this and go to you, Phil. And I'm sheepishly now putting up my big three. I now realize in retrospect, and they say hindsight is 20/20, is rather than citing this as my big three, I should have called it my collective three, because the big three indicate the separation of all these things. But let's look at this third poll, and I'll get to you, David, after we get the results, and then Phil. Anna, cueing you, out of these three, which one is the one that resonates you with which one resonates with you the most? We're talking about digital transformation, workforce skill sets, and relational procurement. And the reason I included these, generally speaking, is digital transformation encompasses the technology, workforce encompasses the skill sets, relational procurement encompasses the process or mindset of how we interact, both internally with internal customers as well as external customers. So, Anna, can I turn that over to you?
Yes, and I've already launched it, and we have some eager people sharing their votes. Again, we'll share the results as a percentage. And I really like the last one, relational procurement. And I think, David, that's your area of expertise as well. So out of these three, you have to choose one. So is it digital transformation? Is it workforce skill sets? Or is it relational procurement? And should you say something very briefly about relational procurement?
Well, and when we talk about relational, so much so in the past, there's been an adversarial mindset. I remember talking with one individual sitting in on a seminar of the author who wrote the book Gating to Weak, Kate Vitasic, and she recounted her days at Microsoft, where she said she was actually rewarded or received incentives for negotiating the lowest possible price with suppliers. And it was the origins, if you will, of her perception of relational, where she said, I was getting paid to better the supplier. In other words, get the best of the supplier at their expense. And I realized that oftentimes that is, and in most instances, that is a very short-term result. So the mindset is changed, is, the old, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate by Harris mindset is not applicable in the procurement world. To be relational, it has to be truly win-win, and win-win has to be more than a superfluous term. So that's really what I mean by that, Anna.
Yeah. And of course, this is a kind of soft type question because it says what resonates with you. So if you can choose, and I'll give you a couple more seconds, see if we can reach about 70% of you voting. That's always nice, I think, to get, some type of results. What resonates with you? Is it digital transformation? Is it workforce skill sets, or is it relational procurement, as in collaborating rather than fighting with your business partners and suppliers? So I'll be closing the poll in 3, 2, 1 and sharing the results. 44% chose digital transformation, 19% chose workforce skill sets, 37% chose relational procurement. what you make of these results. And I'll close the window in just a couple of seconds.
All right. Well, you know what? Let's go to you, David, and then again,
Okay.
as I mentioned at the top of the, and bearing in mind what we led as a precursor to coming in here, in the last 6 or 7 minutes we have coming into here, that it's collectively these things have to work together. Any surprises there for you?
No, not really. And I think, you know, these all have merit and value in their own right. And I would imagine it's probably a bit of a dilemma for people to vote for just one single strand, if you like, in a sense, in the poll. And if you think about all the discussions that we've gone through, the fact that there are a number of different enablers, but ultimately at the end of the day, the way in which we then utilize these, either collaboratively or through the way in which we can engage other people on a journey in the direction that we want to take them, ultimately it's not a surprise that you know, if we set this thing up as a competition, as opposed to saying it's a collection or an aggregation of different what I would call critical attributes, it shouldn't come to us as a surprise that it will split the vote and will depend largely upon sometimes the circumstances and the situation in which people find themselves even coming in to vote, believe it or not. So there's much research about recency effect and the biases that places upon us as individuals in terms of the way in which we vote. And so it doesn't come as any big surprise at all. I think that the sooner we get to talking about having a more collective and aggregative and collaborative approach to these things rather than a singular approach, I think we will start to then see things move forward, as we have in many other cases where we start to think about the way in which we might achieve something. It's usually by utilizing different attributes and skills, not one singular skill or one singular platform or whatever it happens to be, as being the way in which we might deliver a particular or desired result.
Okay, now, you know what, this is an interesting point, and Phil, in passing this to you for your comments, and I've got a couple of minutes here. One of the things I want to sort of set that up with is a CIO article from this year, earlier this year, on digital workplace strategy. And the CIO writer suggests that your digital transformation is doomed unless you empower your employees to succeed, and is craft a workplace that boosts engagement and agility. Now, why I chose this particular comment is it's a CIO. You don't really think traditionally of IT departments looking at the human elements of what they're doing. You only think of it in bits and bytes, so to speak, at least traditionally. I'm speaking for somebody who was in the high-tech industry since 1983. But if you look at that, is this, again, bringing and tying this all together and adding to what David said, that, look, you know, we need to have the 3 points that Anna brought up. We need to have workplace skills. We need to have relational skills. We need to have digital transformation all working coherently and cohesively together. I mean, is this just a verification of that?
Yeah, for sure it is. Yeah, and I think it's you know, the workplace skills. I mean, it's just a catch-all. You know, they are, you know, the skills to do, you know, the skills to work as a team, the skills to get things done, the skills to work collaboratively, and you know, your relational procurement. I mean, that's internal and external. So it's working with your stakeholders and your customers, and you know, it's a mindset that needs to change sometimes as an imperative. You know, I worked in the oil and gas industry when oil was $115 a barrel, and then I worked in the oil and gas industry when it was $20 a barrel. And the dynamic of the relationship between you know, the technicians and the procurement and supply chain people changed massively. You know, from I need this now, get it here tomorrow. You know, I've agreed the price, just fill in the paperwork, to, oh, can you help me save some money, please? So, you know, the whole dynamic, you know, and you know, when oil did drop to $20 a barrel, and companies had to work much more efficiently, and suddenly people were around the table, you know, looking to win as a team, it's amazing how much, you know, easier and more successful things became, and how much more was innovated, how much more was created. So, you know, if you can kind of take that into the good times as well as the bad times, but it's right across the piece. And yeah, I mean, I was talking earlier, when we were talking about digital earlier, I was talking about, you know, some of the things that, organizations need to think about, and some of the values that they need to have to make that digital transformation successful. And it's in your quote there.
Well, and let's wrap it up. And David, I was glad you're able to join us, and Phil able to do that. The closing thing I think in all of this is this generation next focus on building an informed exchange with what they view as partners. I mean, I'm thinking of your soccer analogy. Digital has come about, Phil, everything's there, but at the end of the day, the basis for what we do is still what we do. We have to just learn to expand and adapt to that and utilize it more effectively. And I think we have more tools. But if I were to sum it up in one sentence, it's this: out of all the trends that are put forward, it is wise to remember that the trends do not operate in silos. And the fact remains is that collectively, these trends have to find a way to interact with the other for it to be a collective success. I mean, is that a fair statement, Phil? And then David?
Yeah, I think it is. I think, we're the game is still the same. We're playing at a much higher level, a much faster pace. It's far more skillful. It's a much more sophisticated game. But the objective to win and the way you win is still very much the same. But things will, things are interconnected. And again, without stretching that analogy to breaking point, when you look at the way teams play now, it's a much more interactive team performance. It's much more supportive, much more collaborative, and that's the way that that our profession and the business within which it operates, within which its particular function operates, needs to think and behave and build cross-functional teams.
Perfect. David, 30 seconds, because I see Anna, you're on the line here, which is it's time to stop talking. But let's give David 30 seconds.
Okay.
David, anything to add to that? Have we missed the boat here, or are we pretty much on cue?
Pretty much on cue. Again, all I would say is just think of collaboration, critical thinking skills, and you mentioned it, John, the agility and the adaptability of how we work as a function. And at the end of the day, being able to assess information and make sense of it. So the make sense and translate of information, absolutely critical. And don't lose that curiosity and imagination strand that we will all need to come up with innovative solutions.
Well, David and Phil, and unfortunately, Chris may have encountered some technical difficulties signing in, but you know what? An illuminating discussion as I turn it back over to you, Anna.
Thank you so much, the three of you. And I mean, we could refer also to a great report that Chris was writing that says a lot about his views, right? We have the link on our website. Thank you all for joining us today. I think now we would need at least an hour to talk about the how-to aspects. So understanding what we need to do, talking about the how-to, and really that is, of course, much easier done face-to-face. But this was really nice, and thank you so much, David. Thank you, Phil, and thank you, John, and thank you, Sneha Zycus, for joining us. We'll share as much material as we possibly can. Do join the Twitter chat room if you have any further questions, and I do hope to see you in real life or online again. Thank you so much. Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.